that puzzlement you felt is exactly what philosophers spend their entire life trying to understand. But it is a gift. That puzzlement is a gift that only you can experience, and possibly octopuses could, or octopi. You could say, well, why can't we ask an octopus whether it does have this kind of, whether it's puzzled about the fact that it can sense its world, and is it an octopus or is it something else? One key thing here is that if it is right that self-awareness and any kind of selfhood rests upon a model of me, a self-model, you have to ask yourself, well, where did that come from? And many people might answer, well, you had to develop that self-model during your very early life in order to distinguish between your mother and yourself. If I'm using you to understand me, and ultimately me to understand you, and this is known as theory of mind, then that will only work if we are sufficiently similar. So even if the octopus is self-aware, and perhaps there are churches or schools or universities or philosophers deep in the sea where octopuses gather and discuss zombie octopuses, we will never know. We will never know because we can only talk to each other.
In this podcast, I'm sharing my passion and curiosity for soft robotics, where we share inspiring stories about the work we do and how we can push the limit. I am Mara Dwayne, and this is Soft Robotics Podcast. Support for this show comes from Science Robotics Journal. I really find Science Robotics to be a great resource for reliable and tangible research where we can really push the limit of the science we do in robotics. Great way to stay up to date with the published article is checking out the released monthly issue. All the links will be included in each episode description. We will also happen to have a regular conversation on the most published science robotic articles, where also you can contribute with your question and thoughts about the research. Thanks Science Robotics for sponsoring Soft Robotics Podcast. I'd like to start my question for you, especially since you are specialized in brain and understanding the brain. When we look to evolution, and I think the question is why certain creatures, for example, have brain and body, and there's other creature exhibit intelligence through the body itself. Do you think there's a reason that the relation between the brain and the body and other creatures don't have the relationship, this relationship, they only have the body, for example? There isn't a reason behind that.
I think the reason would probably lie in evolution, obviously. I would probably address that kind of question by appealing to things like the good regulator theorem. So I'm going back to early ideas at the inception of cybernetics, where it was thought to be provably true that in order for any creature or artifact or organism to successfully regulate its eco-niche or environment, it had to be a good model of that environment. So if you translate that idea into an evolutionary context, what we're saying is that adaptive fitness literally is the ability of a phenotype to fit and explain its environment or its eco-niche. So the question then is, why do some creatures and organisms need brains, for example, and why do other creatures not? Because you could argue that a virus is, from the point of view of the virus, has an excellent adaptive fitness and persists and endures through phylogeny in very much the same way that we have. And I guess the answer that would distinguish a virus from a vegan or a person in terms of the kinds of structures that a person has that a virus doesn't have would rest upon the fact that we people have to regulate a much more complicated environment. In fact, an environment or an eco-niche which has a cultural aspect in the sense that our environments are largely populated by creatures like us that are very complicated and in turn trying to model me. So the very emergence of culture, tools, anything that can be constructed within our eco-niche by other complicated agents makes that eco-niche very complicated and thereby requires increasingly sophisticated models that, under the good regulator theorem, would endow a phenotype with adaptive fitness. So that's why I personally, and many other people, would think that the brain has the kind of structure that reflects and literally embodies, in a physical sense, the causal architecture of the world it has to explain and navigate. So we have all the interesting architectural features like a hierarchical organization, a separation of temporal scales, key things like a sparsity of connection. So one interesting question is, what's the difference between the brain and the liver? They both do very good jobs, but what is special about the brain? And what is special about the brain is this the presence of these very long, slender connections, like the wires on a circuit board or the communication channels in some information processing device, which speaks to an interesting proposition if it is the case that the structure of the brain recapitulates or installs causal structure in the world. That kind of suggests that the brain is trying to explain a world in which there is action at a distance, in the sense that wires connect or neuronal connections, axons in the brain, reach out and connect very distal neural populations. And of course, that's the kind of world which we live in. Whereas if I was a virus or a little worm, I really wouldn't have to worry about that. I just need to worry about what was next to me. And I could get away with a brain that was much more like a liver, that doesn't have these long-range connections. So that's basically how I would see, or how one might understand the emergence of functional architectures that were fit for purpose in the sense of the good regulator theorem and in the sense of adaptive fitness from the point of view of evolutionary biology.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could ask you about the architecture of the brain, or why it has this shape. If there isn't a reason behind that. For example, we had a discussion in the episode, in another episode, about that elastic instability. Maybe that's how the brain is developed based on this architecture of the elastic instability. Maybe for you, why do you think the architecture of the brain in that shape? And when we look to different species, do you think the size of the brain, how this changes of the size is affecting the awareness of the environment to take this information and process this to be a living in the environment?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important notion. So just simple things. I mean, if it's right that my brain is a model of my experienced and lived world, then there will be architectural features that are copied from the world. So for example, the symmetry of my brain tells me immediately that I have a symmetrical body, in the sense that the most important bits of the outside world beyond the skull are going to be the body that you used to carry your brain around. So I don't even need to look at my body. I can just look at my brain. I can tell you immediately that I have a particular symmetry. And if you gave me the brain of an octopus and it had a radial symmetry of 8 degrees, I can tell you immediately it would have 8 legs and would perambulate and articulate and interact in an embodied way with its world with that kind of body. We could go further, and if you told me that certain parts of the brain activated or got excited by or processed information about where things were, in contrast to other functionally specialized parts of the brain that were more interested in or activated or engaged by what things are, that would tell me something quite fundamental about the world that you came from or your brain came from. It tells me immediately that there's a causal or statistical separation between whatness and whereness. And indeed, we see that in the human brain. So there's uh, uh, following from the similar work of people like Leslie Ungerleider, this notion of dorsal and ventral pathways in the visual system, so that the dorsal, higher in towards the back of your head, that part of the brain processes information about where you are and the kinematics and the movement of things in a Euclidean space, whereas the more ventral, deeper down below your ears parts of the brain are much more concerned with processing what things are, categorizing objects, recognizing things as natural kinds. Because of that physical separation, that anatomical separation, that dissociation, if I now read that as a statistical dissociation, what that is saying is that the world that this brain came from is composed of objects or things that are in different positions, but knowing where something is doesn't tell you what it is, and knowing what something is doesn't tell you where something is, which of course is largely true. I mean, obviously we have to put the what and the where information back together to generate a prediction of a red bus or a pair of glasses to the right of my arm. But in terms of representing in a computationally efficient way, then I can now use this separation of whatness and whereness to finesse the anatomical architectures. A separation of what and where, in summary, in the world, then translates into an anatomical distinction between the what and the where pathways in the brain. And you can even take this to other fundamental physical features of our world. For example, as opposed to where in space, you can think about where in time, in the sense that things exist and persist over time. So again, knowing what something is doesn't necessarily tell you when something is. So again, you'd be looking for a computational architecture that had this ability to factorize representations of when, the ordinal structure, the sequence of things, without committing to what was actually being sequenced. And indeed, when one looks at structures like the hippocampus in the human brain or mammalian brains, and how it talks to and engages with cortical representations, say in the ventral stream, one sees this sort of computational architecture where you can effectively index, and I'm talking here about ideas from people like Yuri Zaki, sort of using this sort of internal representation of sequence, ordinality, and time to index particular whatness. So really basic principles of message passing get translated into brain architectures in a way that is sympathetic to the causal architectures of the world that we're trying to fit and to explain. Brain size. You were mentioning brain size. You know, I mean, there's lots of comparative anatomy that we could talk about, but I think probably the most interesting distinction here is between creatures that do and do not have brains. And one might ask, well, what do we have a brain for? And I've said it's to effectively explain a world in order to regulate it in the sense of the good regulator theorem. So how would you regulate a world? How would you actively engage with a world? Of course, you have to move. So the answer, brains are quite simply for moving, for acting upon the world. And if you think about it, there are only two ways in which you can act upon a world. You can either move your muscle or you can secrete something. And that's it. There are no other ways in which you can change physically your world. So that means that if you have to move or you have to secrete something, you have to have a brain. If you don't have to move, say you're a little sea anemone that never has to move ever again, then you can eat your brain. And this is a wonderful example that Daniel Walpert likes to use just to illustrate the very simple point that brains are just there for an active engagement with the world that largely is just a reflection of things that move, which is quite an interesting observation if you're in artificial intelligence or machine learning. You're not going to get anything close to a biomimetic capability or architecture unless your computers can actually do something. They can actually move around, plug themselves in, or select this channel of information or another channel of information. So one would guess that the bigger the thing you have to move around, and the statistical sophistication or complexity of those movements, by which I'm intimating movements that are part of plans with a deep temporal horizon, where I plan to do something deep into the structure, the deeper the planning and the more sophisticated and forward or future pointing the movements, then one would imagine the bigger the brains. And that certainly seems to be the case in terms of comparative anatomy, that most higher forms of life or creatures come along with bigger brains and the ability to free themselves from the present, in the sense of being able to plan and model the consequences of their plans and their policies and their actions. So that's where I would sort of place questions about the structure and size of brains and the necessity for brains.
That's wonderful. Maybe because you mentioned octopus at the beginning, and we actually had an episode about the octopus and how it's interesting the consciousness. They say that they don't understand how it works, and it's believed there may be a brain in each of the 8 tentacles. If we look to the structure of the brain with the body, for example, the human, and we look for octopus, for example, the brain and the tentacle, do you think something be interesting, the representation of the number of the brain with the body, or doesn't seem interesting to you to see how this structure work together, or representation of the brain with the body?
So, I mean, you mentioned the octopus and whether one can make any inferences about the kind of consciousness that an octopus would have, and certainly that kind of self-awareness would be intimately tied to the body. So if it's the case that our brains and our information processing in brains is all about moving the body and predicting how the body will behave and what parts of the world I can control and what parts of the world I can't control, where the bits I can control are usually my body, then there's going to be a deep connection between those kinds of creatures that have a sufficient or apt brain to be able to model their own body, and in particular the consequences of moving their body. And that's quite important because if they have a brain that is able to generate the consequences of movement, that brings to the table two important things. First of all, you've got big brains that can model the consequences of things. And the key point here is that the consequence is in the future. So the consequence hasn't yet happened when you're doing the modeling of the consequences of a particular act, which means immediately you've got this temporal depth in your computational device in your brain, which will require computational resources. It'll require extra neurons or extra computational devices and extra wires, simply to support a representation of the consequences of action. The second thing it brings to the table is that it's your action. So even if the creature or the computer or the artifact or the octopus is not aware of itself, it has a minimal selfhood in the sense that it's simulating the consequences of its action, its agency. So it now becomes an agent. And then the bigger question from the point of view of consciousness research, at what point would an octopus possibly, or any creature, become aware that it is an agent? When would it develop part of its model, parts of its explanation for the world, for its sensed world, that would include the hypothesis, I am the agent that is um, um, prosecuting these plans. And you have to ask yourself, what would that be like? And I would imagine, and I'm just here going on sort of what I've read about and what I've seen on television about octopuses, that they certainly may well have a representation or a model of themselves as agent, as the cause of their own actions, as opposed to a something that can plan, but is not aware of itself planning. Perhaps a very clever bee or an insect that can plan to do things, but is not actually aware of doing those things. It's still planning. It's still very sophisticated. It's more sophisticated than a thermostat, which does no planning effectively. It just looks into the immediate trajectory or path of control variables. But other creatures with the ability to free themselves from the present do have this ability. So I would say that there was a deep connection between the brain and the body, in the sense that the brain is trying to predict how the embodied world, or the embodied brain, where the body constitutes a very important part of the body, is going to behave in the future, and then is in a position to, in some species, become a model of that that minimal selfhood. And I think at that point you're starting to have, getting close to the notion of consciousness, in the sense of being aware that it is you that is pursuing these plans.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Maybe when you mention frees himself from the prison, what do you mean about that?
It simply means, I'm really paying a nod to one of my mentors, Jerry Adelman, who wrote a book called The Remembered Present. Many people, I think, have sort of put forward this notion that the way that we make sense of our senses, our sensorium, our world, is by explaining, modeling, predicting, generating, dealing with not instances of sensory data, but trajectories and paths of sensory data. And as soon as you have a model of a trajectory or a path as it goes from the past into the future, then your sense making, your perception, the way that you understand and represent that world, that world of dynamics and paths and trajectories, of sequences, is now no longer tied to the moment. So a very simple example would be, where in your head and at what precise instant did this sentence get represented? So it wasn't at the beginning of the sentence because you hadn't heard all the words. It can't be just at the end of the sentence because I started speaking about several seconds ago. And you know that and you understand that. So there is no instant, there's no present moment in your representational machinery that could possibly encompass the semantics and the meaning of this narrative, this particular kind of trajectory. So in that sense, you are freed from the present, from the immediate point in time, this instant in time, simply because you make sense of your world in terms of trajectories that have an extended temporal dimension. People sometimes talk about the cognitive moment, which maybe about 300 milliseconds or a third of a second. so that we experience our world, we represent, predict, make sense of the world in little chunks or sequences of time that cannot be less than a few hundred milliseconds. And in that sense, because you cannot compress down to the instant, the present moment, we are effectively freed from the present. Does that make sense?
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Um, Maybe a quick question here because you mentioned also the word selfhood, and I'm trying to make sense maybe from the meaning of selfhood and being, because I don't know, maybe quickly. I had this always this when I looked to mirror when I was very kid and I was recognizing there's something who I am, and I just I don't know how to express that, but I feel there's something inside me, and I was looking outside of myself as something weird. How I'm here and how I'm talking, it's weird feeling. So I don't know how to explain it. It was unexplicable and it's weird. It's scary. That I'm living being. I don't know if that's something you can explain or you understand what I'm trying to say, but if there's a differentiation between the selfhood and being in for example, you mentioned octopus, they're aware of the environment. They have this, the spider, when they have the legs and the web, they aware of this environment and they can catch the prey and know if there's damage in the web. So they have this capabilities of awareness. I don't know if you get my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're wrestling with what philosophers have been wrestling with for millennia. I think that's absolutely right. There's a fundamental distinction between um, having a um, a capacity to make sense of the world and respond to that world and just to be in that world in a functional way, and then knowing that you are a creature or an artifact that is being in that world. So for me, and people like me, the explanation always has to be cast in terms of the internal or the generative models that you bring to the table to make sense of your world. And as soon as you say a word like me, that tells me immediately that you have a generative model that actually includes a hypothesis or a construct or a representation of me. Now, you don't need that, to move, to feel, possibly, to sense, to talk. You don't have to have, oh, it's me talking. You can just talk. So, there certainly are, well, I am assuming that there certainly are creatures like you and me that have this additional layer, hierarchical depth to their generative models, to their internal world models, that include this ability to represent and understand and sense make under the context, under the belief that it is me doing this sense making. And that leads to all sorts of interesting consequences. Because if you've got this very sophisticated model that has the hypothesis, oh, it's me that is thinking, it is me that is planning, it is me that is seeing, it is me that is feeling, there has to be an alternate hypothesis that it's not me. And then you get into the world of zombies, which philosophers love. So you could actually argue the very thought experiments that underwrite a lot of philosophical discussion and puzzlement of the kind that you have just experienced or were describing is actually only the kind of puzzlement that very sophisticated things like you and me can actually enjoy. Because to have the hypothesis, I can be a zombie, so I'm not me, or there's no mehood or selfhood, and yet I behave in exactly the same way, tells you that you first of all had these counterfactual hypotheses in your head. So much of this puzzlement, I think, is it's not a problem. It's actually a reflection of the fact that you can entertain these fantastical hypotheses, that you can be outside your head and look at you without you being in your head. So that's just this ability, I think, that comes with this ability to free oneself from the present but also free oneself from the the location that is that is our head. To be able to stand back and model my own brain, or model my own sense making or sentience. That's another, if you like, ability of these generative models that can entertain these abstractions that go beyond the spatial temporal present. So that puzzlement you felt is exactly what philosophers spend their entire life trying to understand. But it is a gift. That puzzlement is a gift that only you can experience, and possibly octopuses could, or octopi. I'm not quite sure what the plural is, and possibly they could as well. I don't know. Well, one, you could say, well, why can't we ask an octopus whether it does have this kind of, whether it's puzzled about the fact that it can sense its world, and is it an octopus or is it something else? One key thing here is that if it is right that self-awareness and any kind of selfhood rests upon a model of me, a self model, you have to ask yourself, well, where did that come from? And many people might answer, well, you had to develop that self model during your very early life in order to distinguish between your mother and yourself. So when you're born, you don't need a notion of me and you or me and mother. Um, from your point of view, it's just a world which some people refer to as an oceanic state, which just supplies sensations and bits of the world you can change and bits of the world you can't change, and you have to learn that. And at some point, you may have to realize that mother is not part of you. And if you have to realize that mother is not part of you, you now have a model, a hypothesis in your world model or your generative model, that there are other creatures or there are creatures. And then you might think, well, perhaps I am a creature. And then you have a sense of self. So your sense of self was actually just testing the hypothesis. Or perhaps I am an artifact or a thing that is like my mother that I've seen move around, and she behaves like this and she behaves like that. Sometimes I can get her attention, sometimes I can't. Perhaps I'm that kind of thing. If that's true, that means your ability to exchange with others and to understand others, understand yourself, is predicated upon and very dependent upon your ability to model others, which means that if I'm using you to understand me and ultimately me to understand you, and this is known as theory of mind, then that will only work if we are sufficiently similar. And I tell that long story because, of course, me and an octopus may not be sufficiently similar for me to ever really understand an octopus. Quite simply because I can't use any of my beliefs about, I can't use my self model to infer what the octopus meant or what the octopus is thinking. Whereas I can do that with you. If I look at you and I can see you, I can hear you, I can say to myself, well, what propositional stance, what intentions, what things am I holding in my head that would have to be there in order to produce the same movements and facial expressions that you're offering me? And then I can use that to infer what you're thinking. But I can only do that because you and me are so similar, and we share the same narrative, we share the same language, we have the same kinds of bodies. We're both, we're both conspecifics. I can't do that with an octopus. So even if the octopus is self-aware, and perhaps there are churches or schools or universities or philosophers, deep in the sea, where octopuses gather and discuss zombie octopuses, we will never know. We will never know because we can only talk to each other.
Thanks so much for this explanation. I appreciate it.
Maybe going back to the theory about dynamic causal modeling, and I find it very interesting how certain area you mentioned, as I understood, that how certain part in the brain affect each other. It's kind of the dynamics how affect each other, and that relates to maybe I find that maybe uncertainty. For example, in robotics design, whatever, how we can design system adapt to uncertainty or anticipate the right behavior, predict the right behavior in uncertain situation. When it comes to brain, the uncertainty and how the causal dynamic causal modeling here can affect each other so that they can make the right decision. I don't know if you get what I mean, but is there a correlation between the environment and this theory? If you can explain it, maybe what is dynamic causal modeling, and if we have uncertainty, how the brain behave.
Right, that's a challenging and very pragmatic question. So, dynamic causal modeling is, as you intimate, a way of assimilating data and, importantly, with uncertainty quantification under the hood. So, strictly speaking, dynamic causal modeling is just a way of estimating system identification, model identification that does data assimilation and uncertainty quantification. It's effectively you're part of systems biology or complex systems modeling, characterized by using variational procedures to solve particular marginalization problems which would otherwise be intractable. You'd have to use particle filters or some kind of MCMC-like procedure to solve the same problem. So dynamic causal modeling is just a procedure. It's a procedure used to assimilate data, usually in the context of unknown latent states generating observable time series, where you also have unknown parameters of the causal architecture. So usually you'd write down a set of differential equations that would generate dynamics in some latent or unobservable states, and then you'd equip what you are effectively building, which is a generative model of time series, with a likelihood model that would map from these latent states to observable time series. So now you've got a forward model of some time series, and then what dynamic causal modeling does, it effectively inverts the forward model that maps from causes to consequences, hidden states, hidden causes to observable, measurable time series data. It inverts that mapping to get from the data back to the causes, and that's solving the inference problem. So that's called model inversion. It's just inverting the mapping from cause to consequence to get the best estimate, the probabilistic estimate of the cause given the consequence. And that applies both to the latent states and the parameters of a system. I phrase it like that because there is actually a deep connection between dynamic causal modeling and what we've been talking about in terms of brain architectures, because in one sense, that model inversion, that inverting the forward model to recover the unseeable, the hidden causes of all our sensory data, is exactly the problem that the brain faces. So the brain has solved the dynamic causal modeling problem, and it may well use very, very similar mathematical procedures, such as these variational techniques to assimilate not experimental or engineering or data from some plant, but the sensory signals, the sensory time series from our eyes and our ears, and indeed our bodies in the form of interoceptive data. So there's a really interesting parallel between the principles of dynamic causal modeling and the principles that you would see installed in the brain that may be doing its own kind of dynamic causal modeling. But let me just go back to the technical aspects of dynamic causal modeling. What that says is that you're making sense of experimental, empirical, or engineering or plant data under a forward model that's called a dynamic causal model. It's a causal model because it maps from causes to consequences, but crucially, it's dynamic. So it's always articulated in terms of differential or difference equations or master equations. So this is not about structural causal modeling, like structural equation modeling, where you're trying to make sense of data that is static. We're now talking explicitly about time series modeling, assimilating data and accumulating evidence over time. And all you do is basically write down a generative model or a forward model as a set of differential equations, and then use variational Bayes effectively to invert that model to build posteriors over the unknown states and the unknown parameters, where the only distinction is that the states change as a function of time. They have these trajectories in them, the dynamics in them, whereas the parameters don't change over time. They're just invariant. They're features that are conserved over time. If you look at it like that, then the big issue or the big problem is, well, okay, what set of differential equations? What's their functional form? And how would I know that I got those equations right in their functional form or the way that I've composed them? And that leads us then to really probably what is the most important thing that dynamic causal modeling has to offer. And that's the ability to score the quality of your model form, the architectures that we were talking about before in terms of big brains versus little brains. What's a good model? And how do I tell, given some data, that this set of differential equations, this particular model, is better than another model? And the answer to that is the evidence for your model. So quite simply, it's the probability of these time series data given that model, the likelihood of those data being generated by that model. So that's the holy grail in, I would submit, not just Bayesian statistics and dynamic causal modeling, but I would also suggest that that objective to maximize, sometimes known as the marginal likelihood, having marginalized or averaged away all the parameters and all the hidden states that cause your data, and just boil things down to a statement about the probability of the data given a model. That marginal likelihood, that model evidence, is just the thing that we actually are trying to optimize in the way that we lead our lives. We're self-evidencing. We're just going around trying to maximize the evidence for our own generative models of the world. Practically, when you're doing dynamic causal modeling in data analysis, you're just trying to do exactly the same thing. You're trying to find those models that have the greatest evidence, but that evidence is extremely difficult to evaluate because to do so, you'd have to solve this marginalization problem to get to the marginal likelihood, which means integrating of extremely high dimensional spaces, which can't be done. So how do you solve that problem? Depending upon your reading of the history of variational techniques, many people would say, well, you do what Richard Feynman did. You convert an impossible integration or marginalization problem into a tractable optimization problem. So he was worried about integrating over the probability density over the infinite number of paths a small particle could take from being prepared in an initial state to a final state, and clearly you cannot do that. But what he did was to create something that was computable and analytically tractable, that was a bound approximation to the log of the marginal likelihood, and that's known as a variational free energy. If you're in machine learning, this would be known as an evidence lower bound, or an ELBO, ELBO. So these are the things that you'd find in variational autoencoders, the objective function that underwrites variational autoencoders in deep learning. That is exactly the same objective function in dynamic causal modeling, and it is rests upon the variational approach in which you know the functional forms of your posteriors or your beliefs about the unknowns. And as soon as you impose a fixed functional form on these densities, you create this approximation to the marginal likelihood or the log marginal likelihood or the log evidence, which is the variational free energy. And that now allows you to do what we wanted to do, which was answer the question, which is the best model, this one or that one? Well, you simply take the same data, you invert the model, you basically optimize your posterior beliefs about all the unknowns using variational Bayesian model inversion, and then you take the ensuing free energy or evidence lower bound and compare it with the same evidence lower bound or approximation to model evidence when you repeat the procedure with your other model. And then the winning model is a model that has the highest evidence or the highest elbow. And there's even a semantics associated with this because we're talking about log probabilities. We're talking either about bits of information or NATs if we're working with natural logarithms. So if one model is 20 times more likely than another model, that means its log evidence will be 3 NATs larger. And that means that a difference in your elbow of 3 or more tells you immediately, well, this model is much better than that model. And then you can take that notion and you can score hundreds of models, millions of models. And we do that quite routinely when creating models of neuronal networks. So, my job is to understand functional brain architectures. So we take neuronal time series measured, say, with electroencephalography, EEG, or MEG, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. So these are the observable data that, signals generated that we can measure. And then we try and explain them in terms of neuronal states. But the big question, of course, is what is the architecture? Do we have a hierarchical relationship between different parts of the brain? Do we have a sparse connectivity? Do different parts of the brain have different time constants? What's the importance of local connectivity versus this long-range connectivity? All sorts of really important structural architectural questions, each of which is installed in a different kind of dynamic causal model, forward model. And then you run these models, evaluate their free energy, their variational free energy, or their elbow, and then you compare them and you choose the best one, and then you start again. How can I make it better? So then you explore a different one. So I'm sorry that's such a long answer, but it's something which I think is really important, especially when it comes to modeling complex systems in medicine or epidemiology, where getting the model right really does matter, and perhaps it'll matter in climate change modeling, which tells you immediately you've got to have a way of scoring the goodness or the evidence for your models, which normally obliges you to recourse to variational techniques and the kind of techniques that underwrote Feynman's path integral formulation of quantum electrodynamics, and that's really the heart of DCM.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for highlighting that. Maybe I want to ask you, related to that, what maybe still maybe for you missing when it comes to explaining the model, or maybe mysterious to understand in dynamic causal modeling, maybe still mysterious, or maybe it's something missing, maybe in the techniques to explain certain behavior. Do you have any encountered situation like this?
I think yes, all the time. But the question about what is missing is really directed back at the generative model. In the practical sense that much of the technology for the data analysis or for simulating the brain doing its own data analysis and its own active inference, that's already out there. As soon as you commit to a particular kind of generative model, you know almost immediately the kind of algorithm or scheme you're going to be using to invert or sense make or evaluate some data or assimilate some data. So, for example, if it's a discrete state space model, you'll be using either belief propagation or variational message passing. If you're working with a continuous state space model, you're going to be using some form of generalized Kalman filtering, or extended, in a nonlinear and hierarchical way. So the maths, I should just add that for completeness, the generalizations of these Bayesian filters that are apt for inverting DCMs of continuous states in continuous time is also known as predictive coding in the neurosciences, at least, which speaks to really interesting connections between compressibility and the relationship between the evidence and complexity and compression and universal computation. All sorts of really interesting mathematical issues here. But to come back to your question, where are the big problems? Because you know how you've got the technology to evaluate the evidence for a generative model or a forward model or a dynamic causal model at hand. The big question now is, how do you specify or choose your generative model? So if you ask me what's missing from your explanation of this system or this set of data, then it would really be, I would read that question as what's wrong with your generative model, and what kind of generative model, what kind of hypothesis have you not yet evaluated? So what you're asking me is how do you become a good scientist? How do you develop those hypotheses, which I'm reading as just a model? So another way of looking at the scoring of a large number of DCMs of the same data in terms of their variational free energies or their elbows is effectively testing a range of hypotheses. It's just hypothesis testing. It's just a formal statement of the scientific method when cast as evidence-based science. Not so much Popperian falsification. This is much more Bayesian and just evidence-based. I go with the hypotheses that have the greatest evidence. So in that sense, the whole game now reduces to the ability to create a space of hypotheses. And that's where the real problems arise. And that's where you need to be creative, insightful, lateral thinking, intuitive, because, of course, before you can even test a hypothesis, you have to be able to generate one and do so in the right way. So I think that's what's missing, in a sense, in two senses. One, there will always be something missing from any DCM or any hypothesis. There will always be a better one. And the thing that's missing from the current hypothesis or DCM is the thing that would make it into a better one with greater evidence. That's one sense in which there's always something missing. But the other thing that is missing is a systematic way to find the space of missing bits, to have that space of hypotheses. This, in some fields, is known as a structure learning problem. The very structure. How many, for example, if I was applying this technology to variational autoencoders, which you could in principle do, although they're not very good at handling dynamic data, but you could ask, do I need 12 layers or 14 layers or 8 layers? Each of those is a hypothesis. So you could, in principle, expose it to a vast amount of data, measure the integral of over time or over the entire data set of the variational free energy, which you're trying to optimize, use that to score 14, 12, and 8 layered variational autoencoders. And then you would be able to say, for these kinds of data in this situation, this is the best kind of architecture. But to do that, you've had to know that there is a space of variational autoencoders that has a discrete number of layers. And now, so you now imagine, well, what about other kinds of structural attributes? Perhaps what about convolution neural networks, the weight sharing that you get implicit in a convolution neural network? That's what's the best kernel? What's the best kind of weight sharing? All of these things. But of course, these structural attributes. Now think of a structural attribute which you've never come across before, like say a factorization in a transformer, or something which a hypothesis about the shape and structure and form of for example, a deep learning neural network um, that you hadn't encountered before that could actually make the um, the, the system and the implicit generative model much better. So that I think is a big outstanding problem. In Bayesian statistics, it's a problem of Bayesian model selection in the sense that before you can select the best model among a space of models or a set of hypotheses, you have to be able to articulate and create that space. There are some interesting developments in non-parametric Bayes that take a particular direction in terms of adding in slots to a generative model at the right time if the model's not working. But I'm not sure that they're really the answer to this fundamental problem, which is how do you create a model space and a hypothesis space? The only answer that I've ever seen that's in any way compelling is the answer that evolution has given us. So you just try out different hypotheses, different phenotypes, you associate their adaptive fitness with their marginal likelihood, the likelihood of finding that phenotype in this eco niche, and then using rejection sampling, you just increase the model evidence for the adaptive fitness. So it may well be that the only way of doing it properly is to wait a very long time and use evolution to find out what is missing.
That's interesting. Maybe I don't know if this question could be related, but when I look at example as we are human, for example, the sense of time, for example, as our brain try to sense environment and get this data. And one of the interesting things is I found that when we are younger and as to grow older, we feel the time is running fast because we maybe when we are kids, we still experience the world, and I think that's give us the sense of time maybe longer. But when we grow older, it seems that it's times fly. Do you think this is something, I don't know, do you think this is something could be related to what you're trying to understand about the brain and how it processes the environment or the time?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question. And a very prescient and current one as well. People are trying to, what is time, and not in a trivial sort of universal clock time, but but how do we construct time when the only reality is a constructed reality from the point of view of the brain as inverting some dynamic causal model or its generative model of the world? The most convincing answers I have seen actually speak to the way that you formulated your question in terms of what it is like to be very young, where time, a week can seem like a year, as opposed to when you're my age and a year goes by like a week used to go. So I think one of the best answers is that that once you've committed to this notion of the remembered present and free from the moment. We're not really talking now about universal clock time anymore. We're talking about something that is constructed. And people in quantum computation love this because they just don't like they like background free computation, pure computation. So they really don't like space and time as assumptions before you start. And I think that's probably exactly right. So in the same way that we construct space through a simple explanation for if I move over there, I will see this or I will feel this, we probably also construct time. So that begs the question: what is the metric of time? What kind of measure equips the time, the constructed time, with a metric so that you have a dimension of time or an arrow of time? And it looks as if it's a quantity called the information rate or the information length. And put simply, it's a very simple, well, it's not simple, but it's a straightforward, unmagical construct. It's simply the number of belief configurations or probabilistic configurations that you pass through as you move over a statistical manifold. So if in a unit's time you in a unit of universal or clock time, you change your mind very, very little, that means you haven't moved very far in terms of this metric, this information length, and you have a small information rate. But if you've changed your mind a lot and you've moved through very, very different probabilistic configurations on this statistical manifold, it will be as if there are lots of moments have passed, lots of these cognitive moments have changed. And then if you compare the number of cognitive moments or perceptual moments with the number of moments at higher or lower in your hierarchy, you can then probably get to an argument, at least of relative time. So that would suggest to me that when you're young, you're changing your mind a lot per unit clock time. So there are lots of things that you are learning and that you're assimilating. So it seems as if, relative to some reference, possibly higher or lower in your hierarchical construction of the world, you've experienced lots of things in a day and you've done a lot of belief updating. Whereas when you're old and you enjoy your routine and every day seems like the last, the degree of belief updating seems much, much less. And that belief updating is interesting because that's actually also mathematically the complexity that we were talking about before in terms of compression. So there's some lovely connections between the information rate and the information length, which is simply the KL divergence between or the relative entropy of infinitesimal changes in the relative entropy of different beliefs as you move on a trajectory on a statistical manifold, which literally, if you interpret it as updating Bayesian beliefs from priors to posteriors, that distance along that path or trajectory is literally the degree to which you change your mind in the sense of Bayesian belief updating. So the more updating you do, the greater number per unit clock time, then the greater your information rate and probably your sense of time, your sense of time dilation, that you've packed more or more things are happening per unit clock time for you as a young person as opposed to me as an older person. So that boils down to literally a sense of time being furnished by the rate at which you change your mind in the sense of Bayesian belief updating.
That's interesting. Interesting. Maybe I want to ask you again in that case, when we speak about dynamic causal modeling and how certain parts affect each other, when we speak about failure, for me, I don't know, maybe correct me, I view, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, or maybe certain features like this, maybe failure in the human brain. Do you think this is kind of failure in how each part affects each other when it comes to OCD, or this kind of illness in functionality in the brain?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole field that has emerged in the last 8 to 5 years called computational psychiatry, and a big part of that is exactly asking the question that you've just asked, specifically of things like OCD, but also depression, autism, schizophrenia, addictive behaviors, for example. And normally the answer you get is that it rests upon a very particular failure in the kind of data assimilation or evidence accumulation that you're trying to do with dynamic causal modeling. So there are a number of ways of understanding or explaining it, but from an engineer's perspective, you can look at dynamic causal modeling as doing both state estimation and parameter estimation in the form of a Bayesian filter. And if we just take the very simplest example of a Bayesian filter, that would be a Kalman filter. And we just think about how a Kalman filter works. then it's got its update and then its prediction term. So, if I knew the state of the world at the moment, I can predict how it would change in the next moment in terms of its velocity or path or direction of change. That would be my prediction. And then what the Kalman filter does, or a Kalman-Bucy filter does, is it then provides an update or a correction based upon a prediction error. So I thought the world was going to be like this in the next few hundred milliseconds, say, or the next second. And then when I get some new data in, oh, it's not quite like that. There was a prediction error. I thought it was going to be like this, but it's slightly off. And then I'm going to use that prediction error to adjust or correct my prediction. And then I get my full Kalman update. Crucially, though, I have to assign a particular weight to that prediction error. If the data are very, very noisy, I'm going to downweight that prediction error. So my Kalman gain will be much smaller. So I'm going to go with my prediction more than I would have done if I've updated my prediction with a very, very precise prediction error. So getting data assimilation right, getting sense making right, rests very, very sensitively on getting the estimates and the precision of your data right. If you're an engineer, getting the Kalman gain right. And so what that says is that it's important to do the right kind of uncertainty quantification, which in the world of computational psychiatry, or at least the kind of formulations I'm familiar with, reads as being able to predict the precision of various sources of information, where the precision is inverse uncertainty. So not only do you have to predict what's going to happen, you also have to predict the predictability or the precision of what's going to happen. And it seems as if much of psychiatry and possibly even neurology reflects a failure to predict the predictability or to predict the uncertainty or to predict the precision. So that you're not able, for example, to attenuate when you need to the precision or the Kalman gain of certain sensory sources of information. And it may sound strange, but that attenuation is really important in terms of allowing people to move. It's called sensory attenuation. So very quickly, or very briefly at least, in order to realize a predicted movement, I have to ignore or attenuate the evidence for the fact that I'm not currently moving. And if I can't do that, then I am going to use the evidence I'm not currently moving to do my Bayesian belief updating, and I'm going to completely undo my prior belief that I was moving. So I'll never be able to move. So in the absence of being able to attenuate the precision of, in this instance, the consequences of movement, or the sensory consequences of movement, I will render myself unable to initiate a movement. Clinically, that's a description of Parkinson's disease, which is associated with abnormal dopaminergic neurotransmission. The reason I introduce that is that dopamine and other drugs implicated in OCD and in addiction and in schizophrenia, they're all the drugs or the neurochemicals that set the gain, the Kalman gain, on the neuronal populations reporting, in this instance, the prediction errors. So there's a really nice connection now between the psychopharmacology and the neuropathology of many neurological and psychiatric conditions, and the mechanics of belief updating of the kind that you'd understand as an engineer using Bayesian filters or other techniques for uncertainty quantification. So if that's right, what that means is that things, let's take obsessional compulsive disorder as an example. How could you explain OCD in terms of a failure to properly estimate or predict the precision or the uncertainty afforded various sources of evidence or sensory data? One explanation is that you and I, when we engage in a behavior such as, say, hand washing, that we expect the consequences of that action to bring a resolution of all the bodily sensations that were telling us that we were in an unnatural condition, that we were very dirty, we're in danger of having germs penetrate our bodies. And that makes us feel bad, and we sense those gut feelings, and we know that if we do the hand washing, or that we do any restorative, any act that brings us back, that restores that homeostasis, puts things back the way that they should be. If we do that, then we predict that all these bodily sensations will go away and we'll feel less anxious. And then that hand washing, in fact, we spend a lot of our time just cleaning up and keeping things in order. We really love doing that, and we spend more time doing that than we do probably eating or watching television. So there is a great pressure to resolve these feelings of anxiety, that the world is not quite as tidy, as neat, or as clean as it could be. It's not in order. Imagine, though, that you were unable to register the resolution of those bodily sensations of anxiety, because you were either unable to attenuate or augment or attend or ignore to these signals. It will be as if you've done your corrective behavior, and nothing happens. So what are you going to do? You're going to do it again. Nothing happens. Do it again. Nothing happens. Do it again. And so simply by denying the ability of somebody to selectively attend to or attenuate various sources of information, you can have a profound effect on their behavior when they're expecting something to happen and it doesn't happen. And so you can use the same example, for example, in autism. What would happen if there was a failure to attenuate all your sensations? It means you can never ignore anything, which means you're constantly tied to the sensorium. Every little detail matters because you're attending, because you can't attend away. So everything becomes surprising and interesting and novel and salient. And how would you cope with that, where everything is a flood of information, everything needs attention? Well, one thing is to basically get control over your sensations to make them much more predictable. And one way that you commonly see in people with severe autism is called self-stimulation. Repetitive behaviors, say slapping oneself or rocking, just taking charge of the sensorium to make it more predictable because you can't ignore it. So, I could go on. There are all sorts of really, really interesting and challenging examples, both in neurology and in psychiatry, that would be examples of what might happen if your brains or your uncertainty quantification mechanisms were broken at this sort of very fundamental level.
Very informative. Maybe because the end, 3 questions left. I want to ask you, did you find the truth in this journey? Because I think you're trying to understand and try to come up with hypotheses, but what is actually the truth that you're expecting? Or did you find it already, the truth to answer all the questions?
The truth? Well, you never find the answer or the truth, because the whole point of certainly uncertainty quantification and the search for the theories and the models of the hypotheses with the greatest evidence is never ending, because this is exactly the missing bit that we were talking about before. I do think, though, that there are very clear answers to that kind of question. So, for example, there is no truth. There is just a belief, a model, a hypothesis that has more evidence than another one, and that we're on a continual journey to maximize the evidence for our models. We're all self-evidencing, whether it's the next generation of thoughts I have tomorrow, or whether it's the next generation of students and scientists that progress that knowledge at a sort of transgenerational level. It's exactly the same process. the process of aspiring and indeed being compelled through fundamental existential imperatives to maximize the marginal likelihood for your embodied models of how your world works.
Mm-hmm. And what makes you maybe fulfilled and satisfied in life?
Well, I think exactly the same things that you find fulfilling and satisfying. So when you resolve that uncertainty, when you find a simpler explanation for something, which, because the model evidence or the marginal likelihood is equal to accuracy minus complexity, when you resolve that complexity, you've had that aha moment. That's the fundamental sense of fulfillment. Yeah. So it's just saying that we are all at heart little scientists who are aspiring for those aha moments, which just is a reflection of this imperative to maximize the evidence for the way that we think our worlds work. So that's what fulfills me. Those aha moments.